She invoked her famous phrase to silence him. He had not been speaking. John Kennedy looked up from his folded hands with the unhurried expression of a man who has just been informed that it is raining in a room with no ceiling, and said with the gentleness of someone correcting a minor geographical error, "Ma'am, I wasn't using any." The laugh came up from the gallery, the way water comes up over the edge of a glass you filled 1 second past full, all at once, from everywhere simultaneously, and it rolled forward and broke against the front wall of the hearing room in a wave that nobody had given permission for, and nobody could stop. A woman in the third row put her hand over her mouth and achieved nothing. A reporter along the back wall bit down on it, and his shoulders went on without him. Maxine Waters sat at the head of the dais holding a gavel and the most famous phrase in congressional history, and watched both of them stop working at the exact same moment in front of every camera in the building. To understand how the most feared committee chair in the House of Representatives lost an entire room to 3 quiet words from a country lawyer, you need to go back 40 minutes. Back to before the laugh. Back to when Maxine Waters still believed the clock in that hearing room was hers in every way a clock can belong to someone, and that it would remain hers for as long as she chose to sit in the large chair at the head of the curved dais with the seal on the wall behind it. The hearing was a housing committee session on federal lending practices, and she had convened it herself. The witness list was her construction. Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana was on it, and the gallery had developed a working theory about why, that she had placed him there specifically so she could spend a morning explaining things to him in front of 3 networks. She arrived the way she always arrived for her own proceedings, with the unhurried certainty of someone whose entrance a room has been waiting to receive. She set her folder down. She adjusted her microphone to the precise angle she preferred. She poured water into her glass and positioned the glass exactly where she intended it to remain. She performed each of these actions with the deliberate slowness of someone who knows that a room watching her be comfortable in a space is a room understanding who the space belongs to. Then she picked up her microphone, and the first thing she did with it was explain to the country who she was and who they were. She said she wanted to say something directly to the people watching at home before the morning's business began, because she knew some of them were tuning in for specific reasons. She said there were people watching right now who believed a hearing like this one was going to put her in her place. People who had not read a housing regulation in their lives. People in communities that progress had passed by, holding on to an arrangement that no longer existed, forming their political understanding between radio programs and vehicles. She said she had been in this work since before many of those people could vote. She said she represented what this country was becoming. She said the man across the table represented what it was leaving behind. She settled back with the expression of someone who has placed a piece exactly where they intended it. She had just looked directly through 3 broadcast cameras into living rooms and work trucks in Louisiana and Mississippi and the interior of California that does not send her to Washington, and told the people watching there that their homes were a chapter the country had finished reading. She did this on purpose, with a controlled smile, and she believed it had accomplished what she intended. It had. She had simply aimed at the wrong target. Kennedy did not react to the insult. This was the first thing she had misjudged about him, and it would not be the last. He sat with his hands resting together on the table and allowed the opening statement to pass him like weather, with the composure of someone who has been insulted by people who were better at it in environments that were less comfortable than this one. He waited for the chairman to give him the floor, and when the floor came, he did not reach for any equivalent provocation, because that was not the approach he had packed for this morning. He thanked her, and the thanks were genuine in their texture, warm without irony, simple without performance. He said, "Madam Chair, I appreciate that. That was genuinely educational." He turned the word over at the same pace. He did everything. "I learned quite a bit in those few minutes about what you think of the people whose taxes pay your salary." A small, surprised laugh from his side of the room. He said he was a simple country lawyer who had learned his trade in a courthouse where the cooling system gave out every summer, and the presiding judge had known him since he was a child. He said he was going to need her patience that morning because she was obviously the more sophisticated of the 2 of them, and he had some questions he was hoping she could help him understand. She said she was happy to provide whatever clarity the senator required. He thanked her again and asked her to hold on to that generous spirit because they were going to need it shortly. A good trap does not appear to be a trap while you are being guided into it. It appears to be an old man taking his time. He began with something so small it barely registered as a question. He asked where she lived. She did not answer immediately. It was the first pause of the morning, and the room registered it without entirely understanding why. She said she represented the 43rd District and had done so faithfully since 1991. Kennedy said, "Yes, ma'am, I heard the representing part. Everybody has heard the representing part. That part is well documented." He tilted his head with the friendly interest of a neighbor inquiring about someone's weekend plans. I asked where the mail comes. Where the house is? Folks back home can answer that one in about 2 seconds. He glanced at the gavel resting near her hand. He said, "Take whatever time you need, of course." A small laugh, and it had come from her side of the dais, and she heard exactly where it had come from. She said her residence was in Los Angeles, and the district lines had shifted over the years due to redistricting processes he would not be familiar with, given that he represented a state with different geographic complexities. Kennedy agreed cheerfully that he was probably not the authority on California geography. He said, however, that public property records placed her home in a neighborhood called Hancock Park in the Windsor Square area, and that those same records valued the property somewhere between $4 and $6 million depending on the assessment year. He looked up over his glasses with the mild curiosity of a man checking a piece of arithmetic. He noted that neighborhood was not in the 43rd District. She said her place of residence had no bearing on the committee's business, reached for the gavel, and reclaimed her time. Kennedy stopped. He sat back. He folded his hands and waited with the patient contentment of a man sitting in a boat on a still morning. He let her reclaim it. He let her redirect to friendlier ground, and her side of the room relaxed, and the staffers behind her allowed themselves a quiet exhale, because here was the move they knew. The procedural authority that had silenced cabinet secretaries and banking executives and 34 years of men who had come into this room, assuming they could outlast her. Then, very quietly, Kennedy raised one finger. He said, "Can I ask a procedural question, Madam Chair? Just so a slow fellow understands the rules of the House correctly." He waited for her nod. He said, "When you say reclaiming my time, that's for when a witness is consuming your minutes. Running past the question, eating into your allotted window. That's the function of the phrase?" She said that was correct. He said, "So it means, essentially, you've talked enough, please return my time?" She said that was a crude formulation, but was essentially accurate. Kennedy nodded slowly, with the expression of someone filing information in a drawer he intends to revisit. He said, "I just wanted the meaning established clearly on the record so that nobody could say later I invented the definition." He smoothed the page in front of him. "Hold on to that, Madam Chair. The meaning of those words. Hold it firmly. I have a feeling we are going to need it." She did not know it yet, but she had just handed him the instrument he was going to use on her, and she had handed it to him in her own words, in response to his request, on the official record of the proceeding. He said, "Let's talk about your district, since you raised the matter of faithful representation." He said she had represented some of the lowest income neighborhoods in California for 34 years. He said she had done this representation from a property in one of the most expensive residential areas in Los Angeles, a property that was not in the district, in a neighborhood where the average household bears no material resemblance to the households she was elected to serve. He said he kept returning to something. He said she had been vocal over the years about direct action, about confrontation, about citizens getting in the faces of public officials in public spaces. He cited a specific instance in 2018, when she had encouraged supporters to find members of a particular administration in restaurants, in gas stations, in retail stores, and to make their presence known, to surround those individuals to ensure they understood their positions were opposed. He characterized this as a call for organized public confrontation, directed at named individuals in private commercial spaces. He said he wanted to contrast that with something else she had done. He said that when a forged document bearing her name had been circulated without her authorization, she had done what any reasonable person would do. She had contacted federal law enforcement, filed a formal complaint, invoked federal law, and requested that the responsible party be identified and the material removed. He said he was simply a country lawyer who struggled with arithmetic, but he was trying to understand the relationship between those two responses. He said, "When someone used words against you, paper, no crowd, no gas station, you called the federal government and asked for their protection, and you received it. That is your right, and I am not questioning it." He placed his hand flat on the page. "But when you disagree with someone, you tell a group of strangers to find them at a filling station." He spread his hands with the helpless expression of a man who has encountered a math problem he cannot solve. "That's two different rules for two different addresses, Madam Chair. And the rough version of the rule seems to apply to every address that isn't yours." The gallery broke. A man in the third row managed one single clap before he caught himself. The sound of it hung in the air like punctuation. She said that was a deliberate and dishonest conflation of two entirely different situations. He said, "Maybe so, I am slow. Walk me through where I've got it wrong." When someone used words against you, you called for federal intervention. When you use words to direct crowds toward other people, You call it civic engagement. He tilted his head. From where I sit, that reads like a person who believes confrontation is a wonderful public tool, as long as it doesn't have to ring her own doorbell. She reclaimed her time. He yielded it without protest. She redirected. He waited. He always waited. That was the thing about Kennedy that people who had watched him operate in previous hearings knew to look for. He never competed with you for the clock. He simply kept returning it to you with both hands, as many times as you asked for it, until the returning started to sound like something other than courtesy. He turned another page. He said he wanted to raise the matter of a financial institution called One United Bank, not to revisit conclusions that had already been reached. He was explicit about this, he stated it clearly, and he meant it, but to make sure the factual sequence was accurately understood by the people watching at home. He said during the 2008 financial crisis, her husband had held approximately $350,000 in stock in that institution. He said she had arranged a meeting between Treasury Department officials and minority-owned banking institutions. He said the bank in which her husband held the stock had subsequently received $12 million in federal assistance and survived the crisis period. He said the ethics process had reviewed the matter and produced a letter of reproval directed at a staff member. He said they cleared you, Madam Chair. I believe in that finding. A person is innocent until someone proves otherwise, even in this building. He set the page down. He said my point isn't legal. It was never legal. He looked up and the expression on his face was close to something gentle. My point is the same one I have been working toward all morning. You have spent 34 years telling working people that the system is built for the powerful and the connected, that the insiders always emerge intact while ordinary people absorb the losses, that the levers of institutional power exist to protect the people who already have everything. He paused. He said, and then the one morning in 80 years when the financial system genuinely threatened to collapse and your family's money was in the institution in question. The system did precisely what you had spent 3 decades telling people the system always does. The connected person's investment was protected. And the next morning you got back to explaining to working people that the system was rigged against them. He smoothed the page. He said, I am not saying a rule was broken, Madam Chair. I am saying the rules you preach and the life you live don't appear to have the same home address. And neither one of them, as far as I can determine, is in the 43rd. A sound moved through the gallery, not quite a laugh, something heavier than a laugh, something that sits lower in the chest. She reclaimed her time. He yielded it. She swung. She was not a person who had survived 15 elections by accepting unfavorable terrain, and she did not accept it now. She pulled the microphone close and found the voice that had carried her through 30 years of rooms that were not designed for her presence, and she brought it up full. She said, I know exactly what this is. She said she had watched it her entire life. A man who could not tolerate the sight of a woman who looked like her holding the gavel in that room. She said it was the oldest story in American politics, updated with a regional accent and a pair of reading glasses. She said this was not about her house or her district or a bank or a rally. It was about the fact that she was in that chair, that woman in that chair, and that fact was intolerable to certain men, and those men dressed their intolerance in folky language and called it civic concern. And for a moment, genuinely, measurably, the room moved with her. Reporter pens accelerated. A staffer behind her gave a single firm nod. A woman near the front of the gallery, who had been close to laughter 20 seconds earlier, was now looking at her own hands with an uncertain expression. The current shifted, the practiced flinch moved through the room. The deep-trained instinct to step back from that argument rather than step toward it, to treat proximity to the accusation as sufficient substitute for examining its accuracy. It held for approximately 20 seconds. Then a congressman at the far end of the dais reached for his microphone. He was a Republican. He was black. He had sat entirely still through the entire morning with his hands resting together and his eyes forward. He said, "Let me add one thing, and then I will go back to being quiet." He said, "The senator asked you why you call crowds toward other people, but call federal law enforcement for yourself. That is a straightforward question. It has nothing to do with who is sitting in which chair, or what either of you looks like." He paused. Some of us carry that history without setting it down when the weather turns. When you reach for it to exit a question about a $6 million house in a district you don't live in, you make it lighter for everyone who actually needs it. You make it easier to dismiss. He said, "Put it away, Madam Chair, and answer the man about the gas station." The flinch left the room. What replaced it was something more useful to Kennedy and more damaging to her. It was authorization. The woman near the front, who had been looking at her hands, picked up her skepticism again, and this time did not set it down. The permission moved through the gallery from person to person. Quietly, the way a temperature change moves through a space before you can identify exactly when it happened. A black congressman on the same committee, in the same party, had said plainly that the argument she had reached for was being deployed as a shield rather than as a principle. Once that is said by that person in that room, it cannot be unsaid by anyone. Kennedy let the silence do its work. He was genuinely skilled at this, not as a performance of patience, but as a functional technique, the kind that is learned in rooms where the consequences of speaking before the moment is ready are real. He took a drink of water and set the glass down with a small, deliberate sound, and for 3 complete seconds that sound was the only thing the room produced. He said, "I would be close to finished, Madam Chair, if this were one thing. One house, one rally, one hard morning. We'd all move on down the road." He said he had certainly said things in his career that did not hold up well under scrutiny. He mentioned once assuring a room full of financial supporters that he had read every line of a piece of legislation that had not yet been printed. His side of the room offered a warm, surprised laugh. He said, "So I am not standing here looking to close a career over a single incident. I want that on the record. But 34 years is not a single incident. It is a record, and the people who funded that record deserve to see it examined in normal light at least once." He turned a page. He said, "You have told this country for 3 decades that the system is rigged, that the powerful and the connected always emerge whole while ordinary people absorb the damage, that the permanent insiders in Washington have long since lost the ability to understand what a grocery receipt looks like." He looked up. "And I agree with you, Madam Chair. I do. I think a significant portion of the people watching this morning agree with you. The system does favor people who have been inside it long enough to know how it bends." He set the page down flat and aligned its edges with 2 fingers. He said, "I am just trying to locate one of those people in this room," he said, "the most powerful insider, the longest tenure, the highest property value, the greatest distance between her official address and the address of the people whose name is on her office door." He laid his hand on the page. He said, "You spent 34 years warning this country about a specific kind of person, Madam Chair, and every morning you issued that warning, you looked at that person in the mirror on the way out the door. Nobody laughed at that. It traveled somewhere below the register of laughter into the part of a room where assessments form and calcify and do not easily revisit themselves." She said, "Senator, with all due respect," he said, "we've traveled some distance past due respect, I think, Madam Chair. Due respect was this morning before you told the people watching at home that their communities were a mistake the country was in the process of correcting." He said, "I've been following everything just fine." Behind the large chair, an aide moved quickly and bent close to her ear and placed a folded note on the dais surface. Whatever the note contained, she covered it with her hand and pushed it to the edge of the table, face down, and did not consult it again. In the 3rd row of the gallery, a man in a faded VFW cap rose to his feet. He stood the way people stand when the act of standing has become a considered choice, a hand on the seat in front of him, weight distributed carefully, with the deliberate composure of someone who has decided to be very still on purpose. He did not raise his voice or announce his presence. He simply waited for the room to find him. When it did, he said, "I drove 6 hours to be in this room this morning." He said it the way people say things they have been saying to themselves for a long time before they said them out loud. He said he had watched her on TV for 40 years, heard her tell everyone who to be angry at and what it meant and what they should do about it. He said he had never once in 40 years heard her answer a question she did not want to answer. He said he had assumed he would probably die without witnessing it. He said the senator was asking the question plain, so he was going to stand there while she answered it. He did not sit down. And the thing the cameras caught and would not stop returning to afterward was that Maxine Waters could not look at him. A man who had driven through the night to stand in a room and watch someone answer one honest question, and she could not hold his eyes. She reached for the only instrument she had ever needed. She lifted the gavel and pulled the microphone close, and she went for the phrase, the one that had ended 1,000 exchanges, the procedural authority that lived in her hand like her own signature. The 3 words that had stopped cabinet members mid-sentence and sent banking executives back to their prepared remarks. It had never failed her. Not once, not in 30 years. She leaned forward to say it. And the lean was urgent, the way every movement had become urgent in the last several minutes, and the grip on the gavel was not quite right, and the microphone was 1 inch closer than she had positioned it, and when she brought the gavel down to punctuate the phrase that was already leaving her mouth, the head of it connected with the microphone housing instead of the block. The sound it made was not a gavel sound. It was a flat, amplified crack that jumped out of every speaker in the room simultaneously, followed immediately by a thin feedback whine that ran the full length of the hearing chamber. The gavel rotated out of her grip, skipped along the surface of the dais, and came to rest at the very edge of the wood, balanced at the lip, where it lay still and did not fall. The room watched. The chairwoman of the House Financial Services Committee looked down at the instrument at the edge of her table with the expression of someone encountering an object they do not recognize. She reached for what she had left. She drew herself upright in the large chair and gathered breath for the voice, the one that had filled rooms and ended arguments and carried her from a city council chamber in Los Angeles to one of the most powerful committee assignments in the federal legislature. She said, I will not sit here while this committee is turned into a... The sentence went upward looking for its conclusion and did not find one. It came down somewhere short of where it was headed, and into the silence where the conclusion had not arrived, because the silence had to be filled, and because the phrase was the deepest reflex she possessed, and reflexes are what remain when deliberate choice has become unavailable. Maxine Waters said it, quietly, to no one in particular. To the space where her gavel had been reclaiming my time, John Kennedy looked up from his folded hands with the unhurried patience of a man who has been waiting a long time for a particular thing and is not surprised to see it arrive. He said, "Ma'am, I wasn't using any." The room went completely. Not a restrained laugh, not a polite ripple. The real thing, the kind that takes a crowd entirely and does not return it for a considerable time. The kind that builds on itself because the people in it are responding partly to the content and partly to the person next to them responding to the content and partly to the accumulation of 40 minutes of carefully constructed patience arriving at its entirely logical destination. A woman near the front removed her glasses to manage her eyes. A reporter in the second row suppressed it successfully for approximately 1 second, and then his shoulders continued without him. The man in the VFW cap, still standing in the third row, placed a hand over his mouth and his eyes went bright above it. Kennedy did not laugh. He waited for the room to come back to itself. The way a man waits for weather to pass when he is not in a hurry and has a coat. And when it had settled, he gathered his pages and squared them against each other, edge to edge. He said, "You have spent your career taking other people's time, Madam Chair. Witnesses, officials, people who arrived to answer questions and found a gavel instead. And this morning when someone handed you your own time back, every minute of it, freely, with a smile, every time you asked, it turned out you did not have anything particular to do with it." He removed his glasses and folded them and placed them beside the pages. He said, "You never really wanted your time, Madam Chair. What you wanted was everyone else's, 11 words, perhaps 10. And they did what 10,000 would not have done, because they did not attack, and they did not perform, and they did not reach for anything at all. They simply named the shape of what had happened across the morning in the flattest, most accurate language available, and then stopped." Maxine Waters did not reach for the gavel at the edge of the dais. She folded her hands on the surface in front of her over the corners of her own prepared statement, and she looked directly into the steady red light of the nearest camera, and she did not move. The chairman beside her cleared his throat and asked, in the procedural register that carries no emotion and requires a response, whether the gentlewoman wished to respond. The gentlewoman sat rigid and alone at the center of a dais that had been hers in every material sense for longer than most of the staffers in the room had been working. She did not wish to respond. The clip had a name before the hearing had adjourned. Someone isolated 40 seconds with surgical precision, the gavel making contact with the microphone, the whine traveling the length of the room, the phrase said into empty air, and then the man across the table, patient and unhurried and permanent, looking up to say he hadn't been using any. They released it without narration or context or editorial addition of any kind. By mid-afternoon, it was on every available screen. And the detail that should have alarmed her most, if anything could have registered through the heat in her face in those first hours, was that nobody was arguing about it. The political argument requires two accessible positions, and one of the positions had ceased to be coherent. People were simply watching a woman invoke her famous phrase to silence a man who had not been speaking on a loop, and the loop did not invite debate because it did not require interpretation. The evening broadcasts led with the still image, the gavel at the edge of the dais, her hand open, her mouth open on a phrase that had nowhere to land. One network ran the still beneath Kennedy's final line in plain white type on a dark background. They added no commentary. The image did not require it. In the marble corridor outside the hearing room, a journalist stopped a Democratic operative who had worked on her campaigns across multiple cycles. The operative checked the hallway carefully in both directions before speaking, and then spoke quickly and quietly. He said, "You can survive being defeated in this building. People get defeated here regularly. It is practically the operating condition of the place. What you cannot survive is being made funny. There is no press release that reverses a room. There is no clarifying statement that unravels a laugh. Once people stop being afraid of you, the fear does not return. You can win the next argument and the one after that. The fear is gone. He paused. She learned that today. He left before the recorder was correctly positioned. A congresswoman who had served on the committee alongside her for 8 years offered a shorter analysis near the elevator bank. She said the problem was not that the morning had been difficult. Difficult mornings were survivable. The problem was that the moment, the gavel, the feedback, the phrase said to no one was a perfect image. It said everything about the gap between the performance and the person in a single frame, and perfect images are permanent. You can argue against a sentence. You cannot argue against a picture. The gavel was still at the edge of the dais when the room emptied. A clerk reached to return it to its block, considered the situation briefly, and left it where it was. The photograph of it, lying there, at the edge of the curved wood, balanced at the lip, in a room whose chairs were now empty, ran in more publications the following morning than any image of Maxine Waters had appeared in years. She had not picked it up on her way out. She gathered her papers and aligned them twice, though they did not need it, and she walked through the side door she had entered that morning, past the rows of committee staff who had risen when she came in and who this time were examining their phones with focused attention. Kennedy remained at the table briefly. He folded his 2 pages once along the center crease and placed them in the inside pocket of his jacket. On his way to the elevator, a reporter asked whether he had intended to embarrass the chairwoman. He said, "No, sir. I gave the woman every minute she asked for. Every single one of them," with a smile. He thought about it for a moment. He said, "She's the one who found out she didn't have anything ready for them." The elevator arrived. He stepped in. The doors closed. Back in the empty hearing room, up on the long curved dais, built for the most consequential committee chair in the building, the gavel lay on its side at the edge of the wood exactly where it had come to rest. Not presiding over anything, not keeping anyone's time, not available for reclaiming. The room was completely still. The red lights on the cameras had gone dark. The gallery chairs were empty. The table microphones were cold. The water glasses had not been cleared. And the gavel lay there on its side at the very edge of the surface it was supposed to command. It had spent 34 years being the final word in that room. It had spent this morning at the edge of a table while a country lawyer from Louisiana said 3 quiet words into the stillness and let the room decide what to do with them. The room had decided